Alright, so today we're going to be replacing the carpet in my truck with a vinyl flooring that I bought online. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm tired of all the dog hair getting stuck in and it takes me hours to vacuum, so I decided to replace it with a vinyl flooring. I know a lot of people will think this is a step backward because carpeting is more expensive and fancy, I guess, but I decided to go with the vinyl regardless. Additionally, I'm going to apologize right away because this isn't a complete video. I've been staring at this video with about 11 hours of actual footage for the past 6 weeks or so, and finally I decided to break it into pieces so it was manageable for me. So this is going to be one of hopefully only 3 videos as I break it up. This was about 3 hours worth of video that I whittled down to 30 minutes. But here we go. For this DIY, I decided to start in the back of the vehicle. It just seemed kind of easier to manage for me. Taking apart this little bracket, whenever I originally purchased the vehicle, I thought that it was steel, but it's actually just this plastic piece that goes across to hold anything inside that you happen to put underneath the seat. You use 8mm sockets to remove each of those bolts. There's 4 of them total, and they're actually, the piece itself is clipped inside, so you have to kind of knock it out. The next thing I'm doing here is removing the seat belts on either side of the vehicle, or on either side of the seats rather. You'll have a seat belt bracket that's bolted into the seat at the bottom, and you need to remove the cover first, which requires a T25 Torx bit. And you can use that to remove 2 very small screws, or I think they're plastic screws, or like little bolts that you have to unscrew to pull off that plastic cover for the seatbelt. Now that the cover is off, you can remove the seatbelt on the bottom using a T50 Torx bit to loosen it. It's a little tight, but it's not terrible to get it off. You can pull off the upper portion of the seatbelt also. I decided to leave it connected just to limit the amount that I was messing with, life restraint systems. So I just set it off to the side. The forward bolts that hold on the seats to the chassis are going to be 13mm. So there's 1 on either side for each of the seats. 2 for the bench, and then 2 for the single seat on the passenger side. The retention system in the rear of the seat is actually a stud. So you slide the seat on top of the stud, and then you bolt down a nut on top of it. Those nuts are 18mm, and you'll need a deep socket for each of them just because the stud sticks up so far. This one in the driver's side rear, I was able to get out using just a ratchet from the front, but the rest of them you'll see I ended up having to lower the seat. One of the reasons I had to lower the seat as I was fishing around back there to try and figure out how to remove it was because the subwoofer is in the way and prevents the removal. There's also an amplifier back there that you will have to remove to get to everything, but I definitely had to remove the subwoofer right away, which required lowering the bench seat on the driver's side. Now, I've purchased a rear seat release kit previously, which allowed me to fairly easily lower it down. Otherwise, you have to kind of reach back there and unclip the bracket, slide it upward to release the seat. Once I got in the rear, I was able to start removing different bolts. Again, the bolts that allow the subwoofer to mount into the wall in the rear. I also started unclipping a bunch of wires. While this seemed like a good idea at the time, some of them you don't have to unclip. Even though they're exposed and they appear as though you actually have to unclip them, you don't. But you do need to get all of the wiring undone for the subwoofer, and you'll definitely need a rivet removal tool throughout this entire process because you'll have to unclip wires which are held in place in various locations. The piece that I'm toying with right there is the seat belt, the portion that you clip into for the seat belt. It is connected to an electric wire, so whenever you get in an accident, it'll lock in place permanently and you have to get cut out. So you do have to disconnect that wire as well as unbolt that piece that holds in both the seat and the seatbelt clip itself. Here I had finished unbolting everything that I could see, so I kind of wiggled the seat to see if I could get it free, but it is actually bolted into the passenger side seat, so you have to wait. Since I did unbolt the seat belt, I was able to pull that out and then go ahead and move over to the other side. There is this inverter that comes with the F-150s that have the power system inside of it that will have the 110 plugs. It goes up to 400 watts. This is the location of the inverter, and they're very simple plugs. You just have to unplug them and then unbolt the housing from the floor. Do not unbolt just the inverter, unbolt the entire housing so you can pull the whole thing up. There is one, I realized toward the end of doing this, that there is a additional rivet, plastic rivet that clips in underneath the jack behind the seat. So it is kind of a pain in the butt, but you will have to get back to that. You can't do it from the front. You have to pull the jack out. Once I got that plastic rivet out, instead of going back to the inverter, I decided to stay where I was because I saw some cool wires that needed to get unplugged, or at least wires I thought that needed to get unplugged. Again, I would look to where the wire is leading and determine whether or not you actually have to unplug it, because it may just be an additional plug that connects two different wire looms and is unnecessary for you to undo. That one is, though. Then you can pull out the inverter and start working on getting that seat out. So here again you have T25 Torx bits for the plastic covers. There's two of those plastic screws in there. And then for the seatbelt itself, on the bottom, you're going to be using a T50 Torx bit to remove that. And just go ahead and set it aside to finish pulling the seat off. Again, the two bolts that hold this seat in the front are going to be 13 millimeter, both of them. In the rear, the seat is going to be held in with the same 18 millimeter deep socket that you're going to need for that. The bolt that holds the two seats together, it is another stud and nut combination, so you'll have to remove the nut. That nut is 15 millimeter, which is a fairly odd size. I had a couple of sets with me and I couldn't find it in either one, so I had to go back to my tool chest. You'll see that here in a second. And I actually had to look for a 15 millimeter socket. At one point here I did find a 15 millimeter impact socket, but it was a deep socket, and because of the spacing that's inside of there, you can't use a deep socket for it. It needs to be a short socket, standard size socket, to remove this bolt so it can fit around all of the bracketry in between the two seats. You'll see me pause here and there throughout the video just to kind of take account for everything that I've done. Make sure that I put either bolts or nuts back where they should be so that I don't lose them. And also try to confirm exactly where everything's at so I remember whenever I have to put it back together. So I kind of thought that I had pulled everything out whenever I finished removing the seats, but you do still have to remove this amplifier because it does sit on top of the carpet in the back. You also have to pull off the C-pillar covers in order to get the carpet out and clear everything out of the way for removal of the carpet. The correct Torx bit size was already on my ratchet. It's 25 millimeter for the top there, and then the bottom is a 10 millimeter socket. Although one of the bolts is an actual bolt, the other side is a nut and stud combination, so you'll have to use a deep socket on that passenger side bolt for the amplifier. At this point I decided to start removing the trim since I had to pull off the C-pillar cover, so I pulled out the gasket for the door entirely, and then everything's held in with clips for this, so you really just have to pop it out and be as careful as you can while you do it. You'll notice right there that it is held on by some sort of retainer. I thought it was an electrical wire, so I left it there. Later on I needed to remove it, so there is a way to do that. You just have to kind of wiggle the wire around, figure out how to pull it out, and you can get it out of its retainer. Again, I started to clean up, take stock of what was going on, and then store everything properly so I could access it later. Once everything was cleaned up enough, I went ahead and moved on to the front seats. There are these little covers that cover up where the seats bolt to the floor. So you just have to pop those out. You can use either a small screwdriver or I use that rivet tool remover and go ahead and start removing those bolts. The bolts themselves are going to be 13 millimeter, so you need that 13 millimeter socket. I went ahead and started one of them using a ratchet. It took quite a bit of effort, so I decided to use an impact wrench for the rest of them. Moving on to the front, you can go ahead and use the same method to remove the covers, and then again a 13 millimeter socket to remove the bolts. I used a swivel joint for the front just because there's not much space and you can't get vertical in that area. But simple enough with the swivel joint. Once all four 13mm bolts have been removed, you can go ahead and pull out the wiring. There are two different areas where the wiring hooks up, so you just have to remove those two clips. The one on the left is a simple press and pull, and the one on the right locks into place, so you have to press and unlock it, open up the locking bar, and then you can pull that whole loom out. It's also connected via one of those plastic pressure plugs to the seat itself, so you just have to undo that before pulling the seat out. Very simple though. Only the driver's side has two plugs, the passenger side has one plug for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. After securing all the hardware for the seat, I decided to figure out how I can pull up the rest of these pieces to make sure nothing's connected to the floor. The mat retaining clips are only held onto the carpet itself, and you'll see that actually a little bit later. So I started working on the different trim pieces. I went ahead and pulled off the gasket, pulled off the B-pillar. Again, everything's just pressed in. And then there's the extra location where the seat belt hooks into the bottom of the floor, and there's a space to get it out. You just have to undo it, and then you can slide that whole thing right out. The front is also very easy. Again, just clips, and you just have to work around the hood pot portion. There is a front plastic rivet that you can just pull out. It feels as though you need to unscrew it, but you can just pull it out. And then there is one additional clip that is in the floor that I happen to bypass until the very end. I wanted to start pulling out the center console. So the first thing you need to do is remove that piece of trim. It is held in the front by an 8mm bolt. So you just have to unscrew that with an 8mm socket, and then you can pull that piece out and set it aside. I went ahead and moved on to the passenger seat. Again, 13mm bolts, use an impact wrench to pull it out. And then again in the front with the swivel joint, use the same method to remove those plastic cap covers before pulling the seat out eventually. Here in the front, just one clip that has to be pulled out, and then a retainer clip for the wire loom. And you can set the seat aside. Getting back to the center console, I did the same thing. Went ahead and pulled out that trim piece. Make sure that you save all those little plastic white clips because they're a pain in the butt to find. And then I started to remove these bolts on the side. And those are actually what hold it on. There are two bolts on either side, and those hold the center console onto the chassis via some brackets that mount to the floor. So it's very important to get those four out, two on this side and then two on the other side in the same location. I figured there was a lot more holding the center console into place, so I decided to start pulling apart the front dash in the center in order to get everything pulled out and anything else securing that might be behind the infotainment system. So first I started to pull up this tray. You actually have to pull up the speaker cover first. You'll notice that I found out that there are bolts in there. So first you got to pull up the speaker cover. Again, use a trim tool if you can. It's a little frustrating if you don't understand how it all clips together. But yep, there you go. There are supposed to be 4 clips. Mine only had 2 for some reason. And then there are 2 8mm bolts in the back that hold that tray into place. So I went ahead and undid those 2 bolts and pulled them out. Once you undo those, again, there are still clips in the front of this tray that hold it in, and there is also a wire for that front speaker. So don't just straight rip it out because there is that wire that you have to worry about unclipping. There are two additional 8mm screws that hold in the top of the bezel surrounding the infotainment system. You do need to undo those in order to take this whole thing apart. I spent a lot of time playing with this. I probably should have done more research on how to actually pull this out beforehand. All of those things in the front are held on by clips primarily. However, you have to pull out the center console trim that surrounds the shifter and the cup holders, and then once you get that out, you'll be able to get to the majority of the rest of it. Here I was able to free the bezel that goes around the infotainment system as well as all the HVAC, and you'll notice several clips that go to each of the switches that you need to unplug before pulling the whole thing out. So this can come out without removing that center trim piece. And it is just another step in order to get out the surrounds for the vents and actually get to any additional screws. So right now I'm unscrewing some bolts that go to an additional bezel, and I'm still trying to get off these side pieces whenever I realize that I need to pull out the trim for the center console. This center console trim, just like everything else, is held in by several clips. You will need a trim tool in order to pull this up, just to make sure you have the space. Once you get it out, you'll notice that everything's coming apart, and that was the final piece that was holding in those side pieces. Make sure that you unplug all of the connections that you have. On the left, you'll have the four-wheel drive connections as well as the trailer brake, etc. And on the right, you have the wiring for the power that you have in the front dash. Once you get that out, try to figure out where else it was connected. There are, aside from the two bolts on the side that hold this in, there are two additional bolts that go in basically right next to your knee. So undo these two primaries, and then you'll get to those other two bolts in the front by your knee. So after I did those last two bolts, I unclipped that one wiring loom that was visible, and I went to try and pull out the center console when I realized there was still something holding it on. And that something is the linkage for the shifter. So you do need to pry up that center piece that I'm about to pull up right there. It is requires a Torx bit to get it out, and that is a T20 Torx bit. So you're going to loosen that, and when you get those two Torx screws out, you're going to pry up on it so that the clips come undone. It took me a while to finally figure out that the linkage is held on just with a press fitting, and all you have to do is pull to the driver's side on it and it will unclip from the actual shifting device. However, the linkage cable is still held inside underneath that front storage area. So you do have to remove that front storage area. You're going to use the same T20 bit in order to remove the 4 screws that hold it into place. Once those are done, you can pull it out. We do have a few cables that connected to that for the USB. There should be 2 USB cables in the bottom, as well as a light that connects in the front there. So you just have to undo that light and it should pop right in, twist it, pull it out, and then unclip it from the bottom. And then you'll see exactly how it's held in. This took me quite a while to figure out because the bolt that holds in the retainer faces down and forward, so you can't get to it very easily. I ended up figuring out that you can't use a socket. You have to use a wrench, and I believe it's a 9mm. It's either a 9 or an 8mm. It's a kind of an odd size. So I used a wrench to unscrew it. Make sure you don't drop it. More important not to drop it whenever you're reinstalling, since you're about to pull this out anyway. But once you get that bolt undone, then you have to pry up the retainer and pull it off of the cable. It's kind of like a brake line retainer that holds the brake line in place. It's just like that. It just presses in there, and it's kind of a pain in the butt to pull out, but once you play with it enough, it will come free. You can set it aside, and then you just have to make sure that nothing else is catching on anything whenever you go to pull it out. I'm not showing the detail of everything I'm doing right here because I'm actually just wasting my own time. I was trying to figure out where all the wires were connected. I was unclipping wires. I was removing their retainers. I was doing all these things, and then I realized that everything's connected to a single plug in the front. I felt really stupid at that point, and then I just had to go back and reconnect everything. So don't do that. Don't do what I did, and just undo that single wire loom in the front. And make sure everything else is connected. That way you don't have any issues whenever you're reinstalling. There are 2 more plastic rivets that you have to pull up, one on each side, right underneath where the seat would be. Here's the second one I'm pulling up right now. I did realize then that I still have to pull off the entire passenger side. The A, B, and C pillar trim that goes to the floor. Again, all of this they're all just clips that are held in. So you can easily pull them out. It just takes some time. So I was very eagerly about to pull the carpet out because I was finally done. when I realized I should probably pay more attention to exactly where everything's at inside of the vehicle. So I took a couple pictures to remind myself in the future whenever I go to cut the holes for wiring and everything else exactly where it should be whenever I install the new flooring. Because although it comes partially pre-shaped, it doesn't come with any of the necessary holes, and it comes with excess on the exterior that you have to cut away. Once I took those pictures, I cleaned up a bit and then decided to go ahead and start pulling out the old carpet and just get it out of the way. The carpet is surprisingly heavy and kind of difficult to manage, and I wanted to like rage pull it out of there whenever I was doing this. But just take your time. Try not to get stressed out about it. You'll get it out eventually. The next step is cleanup, so make sure you get everything off the floor that you don't want vacuumed up, and then start vacuuming. Get everything as clean as possible so it's ready to accept the new flooring. Again, I apologize for making this into so many videos. Just the first video was removal of the carpet. Next week, hopefully, I'll get to the installation of the vinyl flooring, and I'll have to figure out exactly how I'm going to break all that up. But I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope this helped someone who needed to remove any portion of their interior, because I covered all that. So, thanks for watching.